After the death of his father, Earl Godwin, in 1053, Harold Godwinson became the most powerful nobleman in England during the reign of his brother-in-law, Edward the Confessor. Harold led campaigns against the Welsh, who in 1055 had raided into England, led by their king, Griffith ap Llywelyn, burning and sacking Hereford. Gathering men from across England, Harold marched westwards to put a stop to the disturbances. Although Harold agreed a truce with the Welsh, he also built a protective dyke around Hereford in the eventuality of further attacks. Further expeditions against Griffith and the Welsh proved necessary through 1062-3, as Harold, staying at Gloucester, marched into Wales and attacked Rutland, forcing Griffith to beat a hasty retreat. From there, Harold travelled through Wales, and with the assistance of his brother Tostig, ensured peace reigned and took hostages. Griffith, cornered by his enemies, was killed by his own men. His head was sent to Earl Harold, who passed it on to Edward the Confessor back in England. Griffith's successor, Blethyn, swore loyalty to Harold and also handed over hostages to ensure his loyalty. Although Harold's work in Wales had been unquestionably excellent, there would continue to be disturbances. Harold had commissioned some work to be carried out at Portskewett for a hunting lodge for King Edward, but Caradoc, a son of a rival killed by Griffith, raided the area and killed the builders working on site, looting the place as he went. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles describes this act as folly and states that the person who advised Caradoc to carry out this relatively minor act of rebellion was unknown. Caradoc, like his father, another Griffith, would later be killed in battle. Meanwhile, in England, Tostig had been made an outcast from his earldom of Northumbria. The Northumbrians wanted Tostig to be replaced as Earl by a man named Morcar. Morcar travelled to Northampton along with his brother Edwin to meet with Harold and made the Northumbrians' demands clear to Earl Harold. The king was now nearing the end of his life, and it was up to Harold to deal with this matter. And, with Edward's agreement, Morcar was made the new Earl of Northumbria. Tostig fled across the Channel to the court of the Count of Flanders, where he would be left to stew on his deposition and to plot his next move, which ultimately involved a dramatic alliance with King Harald III Hardrada of Norway. King Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January 1066. With no son to succeed him, who would be king? The answer was Harold Godwinson. Famously, Harold had several potential rivals. Duke William of Normandy felt the English throne was his. He believed that both Edward in 1051 and Harold himself, whilst shipwrecked in Normandy, had promised that William would become the next King of England. I personally don't buy it, however. In 1057, Edward had invited Edward the Exile, the son of his half-brother Edmund Ironside, back to England after 40 years of exile from his homeland. This would possibly point towards Edward viewing him as a potential successor to the throne. As for Harold, any promises he had made to the Duke meant very little, as they had been done under duress, if they happened at all. What's more, Harold had a long-standing connection with Edward, who had married his sister Edith in 1045. Although there had been disputes between Edward and Harold's family during their time, it would have been a bit odd if the king went against that and made a foreign duke his heir based on flimsy promises and distant family connections. Other potential candidates included Edgar Atheling, the young son of the now dead Edward the Exile, and Harald Hardrada of Norway, who had an even flimsier claim to the English crown than Duke William. Edgar would briefly be considered king by the English after Hastings, and Hardrada would launch an invasion of England, winning a victory over the Northern Earls Edwin and Morcar at Fulford before he fell at Stamford Bridge, More on that later. It was Harold who made the first move. With Hardrada in Norway, Duke William in Normandy, and Edgar still only a young boy, Harold was ideally placed to take the crown ahead of his rivals. He was crowned on the 6th of January, the day after the death of Edward the Confessor. For Harold, taking the crown was the easy part. Now came the difficult bit, keeping hold of it. In the words of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Harold would know little quietness whilst he ruled. Harold spent the early part of his reign in the north, before, around Easter, he travelled from York to Westminster. It was at this time that a mysterious omen appeared in the sky, described by the Anglo-Saxon chronicles as a sign that men had never seen before. Halley's Comet raced across the heavens. For people in this age, it was a sign of things to come. For Harold, it meant doom and gloom. For Duke William, a great triumph was approaching. For Harold, it may have been unnerving, but he had no time to dwell on what the comet meant. His brother Tostig had landed on the Isle of Wight, where he received money and weapons, before he began pillaging on the English south coast. Hearing this, Harold marched to Sandwich in Kent, forcing Tostig to flee north, where he raided across Northumbria. Earls Edwin and Morcar drove Tostig back into Scotland, where he stayed at the court of King Malcolm III. For Tostig, running out of options, the arrival of Harald Hardrada would have been a relief and presented a new opportunity to reclaim power in England. Together, Hardrada and Tostig sailed to York, where they defeated Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford. In the aftermath of their success, Hardrada and Tostig took hostages and attempted to persuade the locals to join them on the march south towards London, where they claimed Hardrada would have himself declared king. But Tostig and the Norwegians had underestimated Harold II, believing Harold was preoccupied with the south coast, where he expected at any moment a Norman invasion fleet to appear on the horizon. Hardrada and Tostig probably felt they had more time available to them than they actually did. However, Harold II, a man of remarkable energy and stamina, marched north in relentless fashion and caught his brother and Hardrada unawares. The Norwegian army was emphatically defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, with Tostig and Hardrada both being killed. Across the Channel, Duke William finally set sail, after the bad weather that had delayed him had finally settled. Duke William had been preparing for this moment from as soon as he got word that Harold Godwinson had had himself crowned King of England. He landed at Pevensey in Sussex on the 28th of September 1066, just 3 days after Harold II had triumphed at Stamford Bridge. The rest, as they say, is history. I could focus here on the Battle of Hastings itself, but that, of course, is a tale often told, including on this very channel itself. Harold fell at Hastings alongside two of his brothers, Gyrth and Leofwin. With Harold's death, so too came the death knell for Anglo-Saxon England. But what type of king would Harold II have been had Hastings turned out differently? His reign was too short to make any real conclusions from that alone. His 9 months as king was dominated by threats of invasion and rival claimants, with his brother Tostig a continued nuisance that Harold really could have done without. But from what we saw of Earl Harold during the reign of Edward the Confessor, there is little doubt he would have made an excellent king had he reigned longer. Harold had demonstrated that he was a brilliant military leader in Wales, at Stamford Bridge, and even whilst in France, when he accompanied Duke William of Normandy on an expedition to Brittany, where he showed himself to be a man of great courage. Duke William and his Normans were certainly impressed by Harold. Of course, they were less impressed when Harold, back in England, seized the crown. William of Malmesbury says that Harold would have governed the kingdom with prudence had he obtained it lawfully. As I suggested earlier, I would give little credence to any promises that Harold may or may not have made to Duke William. Despite the pretences of friendship between the two, Harold was, during his time at William's court, the Duke's prisoner, and William intended to use Harold as a means of furthering his own limited claims to the English crown. For his part, Harold used all his wit and guile to keep the Duke happy and eventually secure his release. In reality, he never had any intention of letting the crown pass into William's hands, at least not without a fight. It's almost certain as Edward the Confessor grew older, Harold's eyes became more and more fixated on the crown. But on the 14th of October 1066, his dream of ruling England came to a shuddering halt as he was cut down at Hastings. As Harold II's body lay hideously mutilated, it was not a given that Duke William would become King of England. Although both Harold II and Harald Hardrada were now dead, there still remained Edgar Atheling. After his victory at Hastings, Duke William waited for the submission of the English nobles, but no submission was forthcoming. Young Edgar had retained the support of many. After all, his succession to the throne would ensure the crown remained in English hands. Furious, William resorted to what he knew best: brute force. He sacked the surrounding region, and eventually homage was paid to him by Edgar, Edwin, and Morcar, as well as the remaining earls. Also, the Archbishop of York, Eldred, who had supported Edgar's cause, also paid homage to William. Eldred crowned William king on Christmas Day 1066, but he was viewed by the Normans, unsurprisingly, with some suspicion.